Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled The Ethics of Gerrymandering. I can see from Teresa Lawler that already people are thinking about presidential candidates, and Ginger, I think, is commenting on Joe Biden's lean-in. My name is Andy Mink. I'm the Vice President for Education at the National Humanities Center. I'm very pleased that you could join us tonight. It's always good to see so many familiar names, if not faces, in the virtual room. It's also nice to see so many new attendees tonight, and I'm assuming that it could be because of the reach that we've made into the geography world and into the political science world. One of the things that we try to do with our entire Humanities in Class webinar series is represent many different disciplines and try to bring together in this sort of alchemy of the room that you're currently in, people with all different backgrounds and from across the state, across the country. So as you flip through, be sure to say hi to each other in the chat box. Be sure to identify your location and where you're from. One of the geography themes is location. It's always fun to be able to visualize the number of people that have joined us from many different areas and many different regions. If for some reason you can't hear my voice, I'm going to take just a moment for this sidebar PSA. Obviously, if you can hear my voice, then this will be a little bit irrelevant. But if you can't hear my voice, but you can see that screen, please know that if there's any kind of audio issue, if for some reason your audio comes and goes, or you can tell from the movement on the screen and in the chat box that something's happening and you just can't hear what it is, it's almost always on your end, unfortunately, which means it's hard for me to help you in the real time, in the moment. So instead, please consider this screen. Check your volume settings, as elementary as it sounds. Check your earbuds to make sure they're plugged in correctly. It may require you to log in and out of the GoToTraining session tonight. Feel free to do that. And if any of you have any kinds of technical problems, oftentimes I wish it weren't voodoo like this, but oftentimes just kind of going in and out is what seems to kickstart things. I want to thank and acknowledge my colleagues at the National Humanities Center in our education department. Mike Williams, who is the Education Projects Manager, does a great job of managing all of our virtual content. It includes our instructional resources as well as our online course catalog. Libby Taylor is the face of our department with many of our scholars, folks like Sheila and Saskia tonight, who work with Libby to develop the readings and the preview materials that you've received, also to put together the PowerPoint that will be associated with tonight's webinar. So I want to thank them for all their help. And I don't mean this in an idle way. If you've got any questions or concerns, if there are things that we can help you with, please do reach out to any of the three of us by email, through our website, or by social media like Twitter, and we'll be happy to respond promptly and to help you work through whatever particular problem you might have. Tonight's webinar is an audio-only webinar, meaning you'll hear our voices and you'll see the screen, the PowerPoint that's been put together, but you will not see any kind of video feed. However, the most important part of the webinar is the chat box, which is located at the bottom of the GoToTraining control column. Many of you have already begun to say hi and share where you're from. That's the place you're also going to ask questions of our presenters. It's a place that you're going to make comments to each other. It's a place to share resources or links. We have two guests tonight that I would really encourage to be active in the chat box. That's Anita Palmer from Texas and Rebecca Tebold from Colorado. I'd like both of you to, at any point, feel free to comment on, to share resources, to make comments in that box so that you can share a lot of the wealth of resources that you've put together in terms of looking at an issue like gerrymandering through geography. Tonight's session will also be recorded, and the recording of this live event will be posted on our YouTube channel within the next couple of days, and it will be available for you to go back through to listen to a second time perhaps, or slow it down, or maybe pull out different sections for your students. Again, that usually is up within about 48 hours or so, and you can take some time and listen to it again with the PowerPoint in close connection. The National Humanities Center is located, there's another geography term, is located in Durham, North Carolina. The center in our 41st year really focuses on advancing humanities scholarship with an annual fellowship class. We have university professors from all over the country who apply for fellowship. We get about 700 applicants a year, and we select about 35 who spend all of their time from Labor Day to Memorial Day at that building doing their work in the humanities. As you can imagine, this week has the same urgency that likely your schools and classrooms do, because the year's almost over for them and they feel the passage of time, and as ambitious and hardworking as they are, they probably didn't get as much done as they had hoped. We'll have a new fellowship class that starts next September, and I'd encourage you to go to our website and you can see a list of all the different scholars and experts in their fields who have come through and worked with us and then created scholarship from that. Our education department then is intended to develop bridges from that scholarly world to the classroom. I use classroom in a very broad sense. We work with certainly K-12 teachers, and as a matter of fact, I would say our breakdown at the K-12 level is roughly a third each, a third high school level, a third middle grades level, and about 25% or so elementary teachers. We work also with graduate students, and we work with community college educators, and we work with university educators. As we do that, it's really, our intention is to infuse all of your instructional choices and design with content, with scholarship, with understanding something more deeply. That may come in the form of classroom-ready lessons and instructional resources. It may come in the form of collections and curated materials, or it may come in the form of essays and scholar-produced materials that help you just better understand some of the topics that you're considering in your classroom and that you're teaching in your curriculum. Our webinar series is really our most regular and our best attempt to engage scholars and educators in conversation. Folks tonight, like Sheila Kennedy, who's in Indianapolis, would not be able to sit in the same room with all of you, but being able to reach out through this virtual space and have a pretty robust conversation on such an important topic as gerrymandering is really the marvel of modern communications technology. We're almost at the end of our webinar series. I'm really pleased that virtually all of our sessions this year, 31 I think we scheduled, were sold out, reached capacity. We've got 2 more after tonight, including a rescheduled one that now is scheduled for next Thursday, the 23rd. I will tell you that we have already booked all of our sessions for next year. They'll start in early September. We've got a little over 30 planned again with a variety of just wonderfully compelling topics. And the registration for that webinar series will open on August the 15th at 10 a.m. East Coast time. So set your clocks, set your alarms. All of you will be coming back from your wonderful summer vacation and getting prepared for your classroom. And hopefully that's a time you can sign up for next year's webinar series. We have other digital material that you can also download and access that helps make sense of these disciplines in your classroom. That includes a podcast series in which scholars and educators are in conversation around the process of thinking in those different fields. It also includes an online course catalog. By next August, we will have all of these courses open and available. These are synchronous courses, so there are 5 weeks in which you'll have a live instructor and many different interactive activities and assignments in which the group can really explore and immerse themselves in these different topics. Most of the goals of this online course catalog is to develop some pretty strong interdisciplinary approaches to topics and to give you a sense of how the humanities as disciplines can be used in a variety of ways in your own curriculum. Because of this new online course catalog, we also need online course instructors. So if you or any of your colleagues are experienced at teaching online, or if you just really love the content and you'd like to learn how to be an online instructor, we would love to have your application. We'll be taking applications until June 1st. If you go to our website, you can see the link where you can send your CV and your letter of interest, and we'll start pulling together a pool of applicants that we can match up with our courses and give you the kind of support that you need for taking on that responsibility. I'm really pleased that Ginger Park there, a former Teacher Advisory Council member, is promoting the Suckers and Swindlers course. And I hope all of you who have taken those courses found them to be very useful and very relevant. Each year we have a Teacher Advisory Council at the Humanities Center. These are a collection of teachers from across the country and across many disciplines who contribute to and help us better understand the ways we can support you in your classroom. I am super pleased at the work that this team of 15 has done this year. That includes Rick Parker down in Cobb County, who I see in the room tonight. And their work is only an extension of previous years. I see Angel Ann Stevens down in Atlanta, who was with us a few years ago, Ginger Park, who was in our TAC several years ago. I apologize that Lee Holder was in our team a few years ago. So really for us, it's a way to make sure we hear the voices of teachers in a variety of backgrounds and environments, and we would love to welcome any of you into our team in coming years. We will be announcing next year's Teacher Advisory Council in the next week or so. But again, we always want to hear from you and hear the kinds of ways that we can support you. When tonight's session is completed, you will be prompted to take a survey, and that survey will then lead to a certificate of attendance. This certificate is what you then turn into your administrator to get CEU credits for the time you spent with us. We typically like to certify both the pre-reading time as well as the live event that you're now attending. If you have attended more than one, and I'm just amazed to say that I think I counted something like 75 of you have attended more than 20 of these this year. If you've got a big batch of webinars that you've attended and certificates, I'd encourage you to use this, prior approval form that allows you to bundle them together and submit them to your administrator as a packet. And each year we'll be able to certify your time and make sure that you get the credit for this work that you're doing after work. That's my introduction to the center. Again, we're winding down our webinar series. The academic year is starting to come to a close. Our fellowship class is boxing up their work and starting to say goodbye to their study. But that doesn't mean that tonight's session is in any way sort of of end of year tack on activity. I'm very, very pleased that we have two presenters tonight. One, Sheila Kennedy, who's at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, as well as Saskia van de Gevel, who's at Appalachian State University, an associate professor of geography. And together, they're going to give us different perspectives of this thing, gerrymandering, which is a sort of iconic term that I think most of us have heard many times. I suspect that our students, regardless of age, probably have at least heard it if they don't quite understand what it is. It is absolutely something that's on the political landscape in lots of different ways. Just recently, I was on Capitol Hill, in fact, and just happened to be working to advocate for the humanities and visited several congressmen's offices, and they had their big pictures of their districts behind them, and just by the view of them, you could tell that they were from gerrymandered districts. But we're going to be looking at this topic from several different lenses tonight, and the second half of tonight's webinar will be with Saskia, looking at it from a very geographic perspective. But the first part, the first half, we're going to be working with Sheila Kennedy. And Sheila, I know you asked me to correct your title, and so I'm going to ask you to do that in a moment when I introduce you. But Sheila, I know you're in Indianapolis. I know that sometimes the concept of speaking to the whole world through this microphone is kind of new for you. Can you hear me up in Indiana?
I can, although we had a very bad storm a few minutes ago, and easing in and out, but I can hear you.
Fantastic. Well, Sheila, the way this will work tonight, as we've discussed already, and I think many of our audience knows, is that we're going to lean on you to really share your expertise on this topic, the ethics of gerrymandering. My job will be to bring in questions from the audience, so I may interrupt you or sort of pause you at different points. And we would love to have you set the stage for a better understanding of this topic. And in fact, Sheila, I'd like to start with a question of my own. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit.
Okay.
And as you can see from the image on the screen, this is actually an art installation that we had at the National Humanities Center last semester. Each semester we have different artists who do work in different fields, and we present them for the semester. And there's a whole series of images just like this one, which if you're just looking at it out of context might be a Rorschach test, or it might be some kind of abstract art, but of course it's not. It's a gerrymandered district. And so my question for you is, I want you to give me the punchline now. Is your talk tonight going to be optimistic or pessimistic?
Let's try realistic.
This is a really serious issue, and it's startling how important it is and how scary it might seem. So I'm anxious to see how you're going to navigate that realism.
Well, we will see, won't we?
Sheila, I've given you the mouse control of the mouse, and I'd invite you to go ahead and let's go ahead and back you up to, yep, let's back you up to right there.
Thank you. One of the things about gerrymandering, which, as you say, is a term that we've all heard, but I think very few people genuinely understand. So when I say to try to get us through what we mean by that, where the word came from, and hopefully what we might be able to do about it. But it explain a great deal about two things. One, what's wrong these days with our democracy, and especially how important systems are. About, oh, we'll elect so-and-so and he or she will make a difference, but we are all creatures of the systems within which we operate. So look at my first example. Political analysts at the Cook Report have determined that only 1 out of every 20 Americans lives in a congressional district. That means that 19 out of 20 Americans aren't choosing the people who represent them in state and federal legislatures. And I don't think it's an overstatement situation attack on democracy. And I also want to emphasize that some of this is due to what has been called the big sword, or resident tendency of Democrats to cluster in cities and Republicans to occupy suburban and rural areas. And but by far the reason that these 19 out of 20 voters don't have a genuine choice when they enter the polling place is that we have institutionalized gerrymandering or partisan redistricting. And that is a process that, to not put too fine a point on it, allows the legislators to choose rather than the voters choosing their legislators, which of course is what we like to believe is the system. Now, talking definitions, every 10 years, the federal government is constitutionally required to conduct the census. And that census provides a lot of things, but especially for redrawing election districts and distributing federal funds. And as an aside, I would say that adding a citizenship question, the administration wants to do, it would definitely reduce response in cities and states with large immigrant populations. And those cities and states tend to be Democratic. So if that's successful, if the Supreme Court allows that to go forward, that tactic could also be considered a gerrymander, but that's not the focus of what we're talking about this evening. Whichever party is in a majority in a given state in the year that follows the census gets the privilege of drawing the maps that control the political agenda for the years. And of course, the goal is to draw as many safe seats as possible, more for the guys who are in charge, of course, but also for minority, in order to reach the winners, cram as many of the losers into as few districts as possible, so those districts are also considered safe. Politicians have done this since the time of Elbridge. Well, actually, he pronounced his name Gary, Elbridge Gerry, and it was named for him. Gary, who later became president, drew the district that is on your screens right now. And the Boston Globe compared that district to a salamander and dubbed it a gerrymander, which we now call a gerrymander. And that was in Massachusetts in 1812. So it's not like this is new. Yes.
Sheila, I'm going to ask you a quick question. I do want to note for all of our audience that, Sheila, your audio is a little bit sketchy tonight. I think it's likely because of that storm you experienced. So it's okay. Just keep moving forward, but just know that if something seems slightly off, it's likely the weather that you had. But I do want to ask you a quick question.
We had it. I mean, trees are down. I mean, it was a really bad storm, and I apologize if my presentation is kind of sketchy.
Yeah, no, it's totally good. Thank you. I do want to ask a quick question though, and it's a follow-up on a comment that Teresa Lawler just made, which is recently Cokie Roberts on NPR pronounced, just as you did, the term gerrymandering with the hard G. Teresa notes that President Reagan used to do the same. When did we start softening the G? What's the difference in the linguistics between gerrymandering and gerrymandering?
I have no idea. I'm sorry. All I
Fair
know
enough.
is that over the years, Gary became Jerry, and I wish I could tell you why, but I cannot.
That's okay. It's interesting to also see.
Let's.
Okay.
Okay. Well, obviously, when people were Gary or gerrymandering before the advent of compute, a particularly efficient or effective system. But once computers came in, the process became far. I have sometimes a couple, and one's a Republican and one's a Democrat. Current software could draw that district line right down the middle of their king size bed. Have really developed a technology that allows gerrymandering to be incredibly efficient. And the result of that is that neighborhoods are evaluated by the person doing the line drawing solely on the basis of the voting history, and then the in political needs of the map makers. And it is really important for those of you who are teaching in a high school, especially where students are be able to vote, to point out numbers are what drive the results, but these calculations all depend on prior turnout, on prior vote, so that if suddenly everybody increased turnout, many safe districts would no longer be safe. And I have some examples of gerrymandering in this next visual, I suppose. Let's say you start with an area that has 50 people, 60% of whom are blue and 40% are red. 3 drawings show different ways of dividing those people up in order to, in the first instance, represent. In the second instance, you can see that the districts are compact, but they aren't fair. And in the third, they're not compact and they're not fair. And I'm sure Saskia will show you geographically lots of evidence of this. Let's go to the next. Oh, whoops. Whoa.
Let's back you up. Let's back you up there. I'll help out.
Can you back me up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. You pause. Don't hit your mouse anymore.
Oh, okay.
And let me do it for you. I'll take you right there.
There was another. There it is. I'm so sorry. Again, this is simply an example of how district lines can be drawn in order to get to results that the map maker wants to get to.
I think your mouse is pretty happy there.
Can you just click me to the next one?
Certainly.
This process hurts democracy in just a number of ways. Some of those ways are much more worrisome than others. The business of having so many districts perceived to be safe, and they are safe so long as turnout does not change. Those districts create slaters. If a politician's guaranteed victory, he's less likely, he or she, to be motivated and responsive. The amount of time and effort that politicians spend on line drawing and gerrymandering consumes an enormous amount of money and energy that ought to be directed toward making better laws. safe seats allow politicians to simply ignore measures that are very popular, but that they don't want because they don't fear rich. And the interests of cities, neighborhoods, and other communities of interest are much less likely to be represented. I can give you an example from Indiana of that last problem. In my city, Indianapolis, gerrymandering is directly connected to the thousands of potholes that we dodge every spring, fiscal shortchanging of our schools. A majority of Indiana residents live in this state's metropolitan areas, and our cities also generate state tax, but our state's legislative districts have been drawn in order to keep the Republicans in control. And since the majority of Republican voters live in the state, the population in our cities has been carved up, and the portions have been combined with rural areas in order to dilute the influence of urban Hoosiers. Not a typical gerrymandering technique. It is sometimes called cracking. So you're taking the metropolitan areas and taking little bits and pieces of them, varying them to more rural areas, with the result that a disproportionate percentage of our policymakers represent districts that have been drawn to rural, and they are therefore much more responsive and accountable to rural voters than they are to city folks. So when money for streets and schools are sold out by our legislature, our distribution formulas are a lot more generous to the thinly populated rural areas of our state than to the metropolitan area where the majority of citizens. I am accusing the Republicans in my state, and that is accurate, but obviously states that are gerrymandered by Democrats will have different inequities, but this is a very bipartisan process. No, there are no heroes in gerrymandering. Now, as true as that is, the most damaging effects of partisan redistricting are low voter turnout and are the increasing partisan polarization that we see. Lack of competitiveness breeds voter apathy, and it reduces political participation. People don't get involved if they don't think their involvement matters. Contributions to sure losers, and unless they're trying to buy political influence for some reason, they don't even bother sending money to sure winners. They don't see a reason to volunteer if they believe that the end result is not going to be changed by that. It's also very difficult to recruit credible candidates to run on the ticket of the sure. And as a result, many of these races, even when there are theoretically competing candidates on the general election ballot, the reality is usually a choice between heavily and a marginal candidate who offers no new ideas, no energy, and not really a genuine challenge. In increasing numbers of state house districts, certainly this is his chosen successor, is unopposed by even a token candidate. So when you get to the general election, there's only an incumbent or some incumbent's party on the ballot. Gerrymandering is also a very significant cause of political division and gridlock for one party or the other. The only way to oppose an incumbent is in the primary, and that almost always means that the challenge comes from the flank of that party. When the primary is effectively the general election, the battle takes place among the party faithful, and those folks tend to be by far the most ideological of voters. Incumbents get challenged from the right, and Democratic incumbents get challenged from the left. And even when those challenges fail, they are a powerful incentive for placate rigid elements of their parties. So instead of the system working as intended, with both parties nominating folks they think will be most likely to attract support from a broader middle constituency, the nominees tend to get chosen by the most extreme voters on each side of the political divide. And then we wonder why they can't compromise and get the people's business accomplished.
Sheila, may I ask you a question?
Yes, go ahead.
I've got several questions, actually. One of them is mine, but I'm going to start with a question from Cheryl Fox. And Cheryl asks, does this kind of gerrymandering, does it occur the same way in the state legislation elections, state legislator elections, or is it primarily
Absolutely. And in fact, later in this presentation, I point out that this has led to the nationalization of politics because the same who are drawing the state legislative districts.
Fantastic. And the second question is, and I don't know that you have avoided this, and I don't know that you've implied it, so I'm going to ask for some clarification, but it sounds like you're saying that both parties have been guilty of gerrymandering in an unethical way in history.
I'm sorry I didn't say that more specifically. In fact, as we will see a little bit later, there are two cases pending before the Supreme Court right now, one from Maryland where it and one from North Carolina where the Republicans did it. There are no heroes in this story.
That's really a fantastic phrase. Thank you.
Let's go on. I'm beginning to, as I say, I would really like to be, I'm just going all over the place.
Let me put you back where you belong. There you go.
You can find me back. Thank you. Good government groups. Okay. When we talk about government legitimacy, that implies a lot is considered legitimate if it follows its own rules and if it has genuine popular democratic support. So think about this. When turnout action is low and only the most partisan members of each party go to the polls, there's a relatively small number of votes that get split between two candidates, even if you even have two candidates, smaller number if you don't. Okay, so you end up with a representative who has been elected, chosen by perhaps 10 to 20% of the voters in the district. That does raise the issue of government legitimacy. One of the most complete reviews of the recent scholarly literature on this, interestingly enough, appeared in an amicus brief that was filed by political scientists Thomas Mann and Norman Ornstein in the case that's on your screen. Mann is a Democrat, Ornstein's a Republican. And as I say, they're both political scientists, and they've written extensively about redistricting. And they cited studies that tied redistricting to the advantages of it. We all say very hard to defeat an incumbent. Much of that is because of this of gerrymandering or redistricting. They also are science by of representatives on maps that are drawn by state level politicians. This gets back to the question that you raised a couple of minutes ago. Operates to reinforce, and other people have called the nationalization of politics. One of the most interesting that they cited to investigated whether representatives who were elected from districts that had been drawn by independent commissions, and by the way, I noticed that several people in the I guess it's an audience, where they have instituted an independent commission, and that seems to be working, at least from my standpoint, very well. But if what they looked at was, okay, if he's to a state district or congressional district from a place where your lines were drawn by an independent commission, than representatives from districts that were drawn by politicians who were gerrymandering. And that's important because redistricting, in most cases, state level party dominance. In my state, if my state were to reform its redistricting practices, which they don't seem likely to do, but if they did, Republicans would still control Indiana. We're a red state. They probably would not have today's supermajority, but we would, and Illinois would still be a blue state, and so forth. So it becomes important to look to see whether a representative who is elected from gerrymandering, non-gerrymandered district would be more likely to work across the aisle. And the scholars who did this study, their hypothesis was it would, and they were shocked out that it did. The evidence suggested that politically independent redistricting reduced partisanship in the voting behavior of congressional delegations in statistically significant ways. And that's worth considering. You know, good government groups, and there are a lot of them working on this, League of Women Voters, Common Cause, a number of others, argue that gerrymandering is both unethical and inconsistent with democracy. When legislators draw districts from which they stand to benefit, that's a conflict of interest. And it's hard to consider democratic when districts are drawn to reach a predetermined result and voters are deprived of an actual choice. You asked earlier, what can be done? Well, that is the question. That is always the question. In states with initiatives and referenda, those states have used those mechanisms, Michigan, Ohio, others, and they've used them to change the way that their districts are drawn, California. But achieving reform, have initiatives or referenda, is much more difficult because you have to convince the people who benefit from the system as it is to change it in ways that may not continue their benefit. And thus far, the Supreme Court has refused to get involved when the issue is partisan gerrymandering as opposed to racial gerrymandering. You know, as you got on here, I did Baker v. Carr in 1962, and we often refer to that case as one person, one vote decision. But the state of Tennessee, believe it or not, had not reapportioned its General Assembly since 1901. So, and obviously during that period of time, there was growth and redistribution of the state's population. And the plaintiffs in that case said, hey, we're being denied the equal protection of the laws. And the Supreme Court agreed. They ruled that an apportionment case could be reviewed on 14th Amendment grounds, in other words, equal protection grounds, so long as those grounds were independent from questions that were clearly assigned to political decision makers. This is a doctrine that is sometimes called by itself into issues that they believe have been remitted to the political process. But since Baker, involving both racial and partisan gerrymandering. However, only two of those cases, Davis versus Bandemer, which actually arose here from Indiana, and I can't even pronounce the other, focused exclusively on the issue of partisan redistricting. And in each of those cases, the court declined to act. Although it did, fortunately, narrowly rule that the issue wasn't totally given to the political process, that the courts could decide the issue. We call that justiciable. The court didn't act in either of those cases, however, because it said there was really no reliable way for them to determine whether a district had been intentionally gerrymandered for partisan advantage, or whether that was just, the way things happened to go. And in order to find a deprivation of equal protection, plaintiffs have to be able to prove that there was a discriminatory intent and a discriminatory effect. Now, since those cases have a variety of standards that would allow the court to make that determination, and lower courts have accepted and applied at least one of them, and that's called the efficiency gap. And I'm not going to go through the way in which that works, because frankly, I'm not quite sure I understand it. But two cases appealed from lower court decisions. One is that Republican gerrymander from North Carolina and a Democratic gerrymander from Maryland. Those cases are dated, and they've been argued in the current Supreme Court term. The Republican gerrymander in North Carolina, interestingly enough, because the court has previously disallowed racial gerrymandering, one of the people who drew the lines in North Carolina made a big deal of the fact that, yeah, but we just did this for political reasons, racial reasons. So we will see how that plays in the court's decision. If the court affirms the lower court decisions that applied the efficiency gap test and intentionally gerrymandered in violation of the constitutional provision, equal protection, the voters in states that don't allow initiatives or referenda can bring lawsuits, force changes. In other words, here in Indiana, there could be a lawsuit that says the Supreme Court says you can't do this, and then our courts would, whether in fact Indiana is gerrymandered or not, and whether whatever it did do met the test that the Supreme Court laid down. If however, the court does not choose to intervene in those cases, if it does not uphold the lower court decisions, those of us who live in states, there is no other mechanism, will have a very, very difficult time forcing change a way of drawing our lines. And I think it is now up to.
Thank you so much, Sheila. And
I think I'm done. Saskia's time, unless there are some more questions.
Thank you so much, Sheila. I do appreciate you taking some time to share and really, I think, offering us that legal perspective. And again, I apologize to the audience that the severe weather in the Indianapolis area, I think, made it a little hard to understand some of what you said. But on the other hand, your slides really offer a good summary of, I think, the points that you were making. Earlier, I asked you if you were going to be an optimistic or a pessimistic view of gerrymandering. And really, as you played this out, I mean, it seems like it's sort of an overwhelming system that we're thinking about. And in some ways, I think that bringing Saskia in now is actually going to be more of the optimistic. And as educators, as teachers, we're always looking for ways to share with our students, give them a deeper understanding of really complex topics like gerrymandering. And maybe it's that education, maybe it's those resources that then allow us to address the kinds of issues that we've seen here. So Saskia, I've brought you now into the conversation, and if Sheila offered a really specific legal lens. I think your view as a geographer might be an interesting way to open students' eyes, in which maybe that's the way to be optimistic about this.
Yes, thank you.
Let's see. Go ahead.
Okay.
Let's see. So pause just for a second, Saskia. We've got some really bad feedback on your end. Let me see if I can. Saskia, try now.
Okay.
Perfect. Thanks.
Okay. Great. I am actually optimistic because I deal with college students as a college professor, and I also do outreach as the North Carolina State Steward with K through 12 students. And I think students are more engaged in this topic than I was. I'm 40 years old, and so I graduated college a little while ago, although I never seem to have left. But students are very engaged in this, and they see the future is through voting, and they're very interested in this process. And I think you have to put it in the context of some of the more recent students, college students. Their first time voting may have been with our current president, and that the results may have surprised some of them. And understanding why that happened, if there's a difference in the popular vote versus the electoral college and how that works, I think it makes students really engaged in the process. I just hit the button to move forward. Okay. I want to thank my collaborators on this project, Rebecca Theobald from the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and she's online in this webinar, and also Anita Palmer from GIS, etc., who both have spent probably about over 100 hours on this project. This project was funded by the NCRGE, and the point of this project is to create tools, both using the National Geographic Giant State Maps and also ArcGIS online tools for every state. So every educator or civic group can go to GeoCivics. They can search for that online and find GeoCivics and access state resources. And later on in this webinar, you're going to see a video that I did with students here at App State, also with our National Park Service liaison and our provost, that talks about the importance of geography and also understanding how we look at population shifts across the state. North Carolina is a really good case study, like Sheila mentioned, because we are a mess in terms of gerrymandering, and I'll go into that here in a little bit. So what are some of these geographical questions that we are looking at? We really focus on distribution, pattern, and spatial change over time. So when we're looking at population change in North Carolina at the census data, we were looking at 1870, 1920, and 2010 census data, and looking at the distribution of how people shifted across North Carolina. But you can do this in every state. And what's telling is how we then draw districts around that population shift. And Sheila mentioned that this is not usually an open process. And I know some of your comments were saying, why aren't there independent committees in each state to draw or redistrict these states? And that's a really good question. And I think that's what a lot of organizations are asking as the lead up to the 2020 election and afterwards, is why is this such a closed process? Why isn't it more open, even no matter who's in charge of the legislature in the states, whether it's Democrats or Republicans? But why this is important for your students to understand is the human geography side of, why populations shifted. So for example, in North Carolina, we can go into the history of the state and look at the economic drivers in the state, such as textiles, tobacco, and looked how those industries shifted. Also look at physical geography boundaries, like for us with the Piedmont versus coastal plain, looking at the fall line and navigable rivers, and how when people when Europeans first came to the United States, how when they stopped being able to navigate rivers, they would stop basically spreading west until there was more of a road structure, and then we have railroads, and then the highway system after World War II. And so how those kinds of changes in technology, shifts in transportation affected our states and how people live and where and why. So those are all different questions we should ask our students when we start talking about population, census data, and then go into redistricting and then gerrymandering. So geography is really important to look at these changes, and I would argue that, and I say this in the video coming up, but we often ask, you know, when something happened, like when did the population shift? When did we first have cities go over? And in this figure on the top right, you can see that over the 2 million people mark, these larger cities, but it's really interesting to look at it geographically and say, where is this happening? And so when we look at just the US population, you can see that the eastern half of the United States is much more populated than the western half of the United States. However, some states, when we think of elections and we think about, you know, what states are the hotspot states that we really look at, we always look at Texas, we always look at California, we always look at Florida, and throughout the Northeast. But you know, we don't normally think of swing states in terms of elections. We don't think of Idaho or Montana, areas that just have less population. And that is important to talk about is the minute you start talking about where people live and why. So what resources are there, what technologies are there, what infrastructure, why are people living where they do, how does that tie into logistics, how does that tie into access, and what is the makeup of those populations as well. So the objective of our project was to understand the apportionment and redistricting process in the United States. And we do this by looking at every single state. And Rebecca has developed a tool where you can look at census data from every state in the United States through 3 different time periods and compare population shifts. And then Anita has digitized that in ArcGIS online, an incredible platform for doing this digitally. So you start on the giant map and then you transition to the online component. Again, this has been over hundreds of hours of work. It's been an incredible process and I'm very proud to be part of it. But I think how to begin this in your head as an educator is to start looking at your own state and look to see how many districts you have currently. In the past, how many have there been and why has that shifted? Is your state growing in population or is it shrinking in population? How are the districts divided mathematically? So North Carolina has a numerical number. Each district is supposed to have 733,499 people or about that, according to the 2010 census data. That has now changed and will change in 2020. How do we define gerrymandering? And one important thing to talk about redistricting, the redistricting process is redrawing districts for Congress and state legislatures. It happens after the census. That happens every 10 years. So the next census obviously is 2020. But redistricting is not the same as gerrymandering. Redistricting means redrawing of districts, while gerrymandering means the process is unfair somehow. And like Sheila said earlier, when we talk about gerrymandering, we're usually talking about partisan gerrymandering, racial gerrymandering, or incumbent protection gerrymandering, where people want to protect their districts. So North Carolina, as a case study, has a history of unfair districts. Other states do as well, but several major precedents in voting rights coming from redistricting in North Carolina include Thornburg and Gingles and Shaw versus Reno, in case you want to look those up. But both parties have drawn gerrymanders. So right now we have a Republican legislature, but they are not the first legislature to gerrymander North Carolina. And I would argue every state has had this unfortunate history. But the question that keeps popping up is why is this legal? And this is something that we'll talk about as a group at the end of the presentation, I would welcome Sheila to weigh in too in the comments of, how is this legal? I would just say that partisan gerrymandering is currently legal, although it's being challenged in the courts. Racial gerrymandering is illegal under the Voting Rights Act. But most states would argue that they are not racially gerrymandering, that they are using partisan gerrymandering, even though it, by different views, could easily be looked at as racial gerrymandering. So I encourage you, when you talk about this with your students, to look at historical divides in your state, and then also look at urban versus rural areas. So I live in the mountains of North Carolina. Our area of North Carolina is very rural, low population. If we look at where's the hub of populations in North Carolina, which we'll do shortly, they're around urban areas like Charlotte, Research Triangle, even Asheville to some extent. And so our area is grouped into a larger district spatially than more urban areas. So you could talk about that very easily within each of your states. So enumeration, this is important. We want to count everybody, right? We want to count everyone in the census. And there's different ways to do that. In the case of looking at test runs by state of how we're going to do that, like in Providence, we want to do that by submitting our census data on the phone, online, or by mail. Mail is becoming less popular. More people are wanting to talk about it, talk about their information online. But it is required by the Constitution that we are able to count our population. And again, Sheila mentioned this before, but one person is supposed to represent one vote. So getting an accurate tally of how many people we have in the United States broken down by state is very important for understanding how many districts we should have per state and how that is going to make up the Electoral College. So apportionment, when we look at which states are gaining in population versus losing in population. So state populations change over time. North Carolina, this is in 2010, we're actually expected to go up in population. We're supposed to gain a district, so going from 13 to 14 districts in the 2020 census. This is based on survey information, which is different than census information. Survey information is testing a small number of people, getting a survey of a sample, basically, where the census is supposed to be comprehensive. The census is supposed to get a tally of everyone. So when we are looking at which states are gaining in population, which states are losing in population, Texas continues to grow, and substantially. I mean, gaining 4 districts is quite large, just like Texas, I guess. But unfortunately, other states like Ohio and New York are losing in population, and therefore they're losing districts. So apportionment is a range of values depending on how many people you have per state, right? So one of the things we look for with apportionment is making sure that each state has at least one representative. The reapportionment process increases or decreases the number of seats each state has in the House of Representatives. So if North Carolina, for example, goes from 13 districts to 14 districts, then we would have another seat. More representation for state means more influence in legislature and the presidential election cycle, because they would have more votes in the Electoral College as well. And that's really important. So when we look at, districts in the bottom left here, we can see how many people per representative we have. Again, in North Carolina, we have 733,499 people per representative. Wyoming has 564,000, but Wyoming only has a couple districts. So this is one of the areas that just has less population. So Wyoming may have like 3 districts or 2 districts, but then you look at California that has a lot of districts, but they still have a huge population per representative because the population is just so dense. So obviously they get to have more say in the Electoral College as well, just based on apportionment of districts. So when we look at the election map in 2016, we can see North Carolina here, but other states highlighted as well. And so with the Electoral College, how was that decided? In North Carolina's case, we have 13 districts and then 2 state senators, so 15 electoral votes. And that should be the case for every state. So when I mentioned Wyoming earlier, you know, here we have the population of Wyoming and 2 senators and then 1 district. Texas, again, is pretty high in number, 38, California. And so again, when we look at these numbers on a national scale per state, you can see how when we look at swing states, again, like California, Texas, Florida, and if you remember from the last election, certain districts and areas were more important in Florida than others, right? Like Palm Beach had a lot of issues with voting, and that had to do with how they locally organized their voting equipment. But we were paying close attention to that voting area because it ended up being more of a swing area because it's more of an urban area than rural areas of North Carolina, more in the Panhandle. So more rural areas in Florida, I'm sorry, in the Panhandle. So geography matters with this. Urban versus rural, how districts are grouped, which counties are grouped and why. And so when we look at fair districts within each of these states, some of the things we want to look for are keeping cities and counties whole. We don't want to split cities down the middle. We want to keep them together. You want to keep communities whole. You want these districts to have regular shapes. They should not have the kind of butterfly look that when we started the presentation. Districts should not be split that way. They should have a regular shape. Have competitive districts, and they should follow geographic boundaries. So if there's a river, it should follow along that river course and not go over the river into part of another area. So we look at physical geography and also human geography in terms of how these districts should look. Now that's a nonpartisan way to approach it, and like we've reviewed basically for the last hour, that's not how we actually draw the districts. It's very much in a partisan way, and it's based on who has the legislative control. So for the 2020 census, going back to North Carolina as a case study, we're supposed to gain a district. Other areas are losing in population. I grew up outside of Pittsburgh, but if we look at Pennsylvania, it's losing 1 seat. Then we look at, and again, this is based on survey information. We don't have the 2020 census data yet, obviously. So we don't know exactly, for example, with Texas, if they're going to gain 2 or 3, or if Montana is going to gain 1 or none, because we don't have the actual census data yet. This is based on survey information of population data. North Carolina is a very interesting shape. The most contested district in our state here is District 12. This is the old map of District 12. North Carolina was told that they had to redraw their districts, and they had to, so this was an older map. But District 12 looked like this, and why it was so contentious was District 12 is supposed to represent Charlotte, North Carolina, a major metropolitan urban area, but it actually extended all the way up the highway and towards the High Point area, which it was not supposed to do. And so when it did that, it caused a lot of problems and is obviously an awkward shape. It's separating out areas of cities. It's not keeping communities whole, and so it violated all of the rules that we kind of set aside for how we draw districts. So now District 12 is basically just around the Charlotte area. And when we look at, which areas of North Carolina are growing the most, it's Wake County up here and Mecklenburg County down here. And so that's where the growth is. And so, and like Sheila was talking about packing and cracking, the idea of lumping people together and breaking people apart depending on what your goal is. But just geographically, real quick, I want to point out when we look at the districts of North Carolina, I'm up here in the northwestern part. Okay, I'm right on the Tennessee, almost Virginia border. So when we look at this area, it's a larger geographic area compared to District 12, right? Then you look at the eastern part of the state here in the coastal plain. Look how much area of the state is covered with just one district, right? That's District 3. So, there's just not the same population density. So that's why these districts are so much larger and much more condensed here.
Saskia, may I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out which comments to comment on.
Yeah, and I'm going to bring those in, and given I wanted you to cover a lot of your material before we started bringing some of these questions, but I've got one question for you. Bryson, who I think lives in Greensboro, noted that the District 12 line, that sort of funky shape from Charlotte up to High Point just south of Greensboro, is actually in some cases no wider than I-85, right? It's literally just connecting the dots from one area to the other so that it can gerrymander in these areas. Earlier tonight, Rick Parker, who lives down in outside of Atlanta, noted that in some ways maps have become weaponized, right? Gerrymandering is a weaponized version of sort of being able to draw these districts in such precise ways. Tell me from a geographer's perspective how something like GIS, geospatial technologies, have both aided us in seeing this problem tonight, but also created the problem, because you can be so laser beamed in terms of drawing these maps. How do geographers actually assist in the gerrymandering?
Sure, and I think when we're talking about that as far as being laser focused, I think it's an issue of scale, like a lot of things with geography. So I just want to point out Asheville is down here, right? And what we have is in Asheville, we have the Not So Fun Run. And you can see Asheville's kind of taken in by this district here. And the Not So Fun Run actually draws the gerrymandered lines. If you were to zoom in on this, and you could do this in GIS, you could look at where all of these indentations are, like these shark teeth that are sticking out, why they exist, and they're literally street by street. So the Not So Fun Run runs literally block by block through the gerrymandered district around Asheville, because it is purposeful. And one of the things that I think is so powerful about GIS, and Anita Palmer does a great job with her online tutorials and in general with GIS, etc., is looking at all the different layers. So we look at not only population density, we look at income, we look at demographic information, and all of that can be looped in for legislators to decide which areas do we want to include and which areas do we want to exclude. And I don't think GIS is the problem. I think that people are the problem. And I think that not all people, just the people that decide they want to include and exclude others based on their goals. And so I think a bipartisan independent council in each state that looks at redistricting in their state is really important. And some states have been very successful with this. Iowa has been successful with this. Other states like North Carolina, it's gotten better. Like I said, District 12 is now just around Mecklenburg County, where it should be. It should not go up this I-85 corridor and into High Point. It looks like a skinny Italy, upside down and backwards a little bit. but that is not, that's a very much a gerrymandered shape. So whenever we say, we look at something and we say, that's a weird shape, that's because it's purposeful. You're either trying to include some people and exclude others. And the reasons behind that could be based on which voting group they're in, or could be based on racial lines. And that's what the Supreme Court has to decide on a state-by-state basis. Is that legal or not? And we know that racial gerrymandering is not legal, but in terms of partisan gerrymandering, that's in the Supreme Court's hands.
It's being decided this session, Sheila noted.
Yes.
And so from a geographer's perspective, you know, of the themes of geography or the ways you look at the world as a geographer or a human geographer, gerrymandering seems to really take advantage of all of those things that you just mentioned: scale, location, relationship, movement even. And it sounds like what you're suggesting is that these kinds of maps, because they're not intentional, these are a representation of the exclusion that politicians have decided to embrace.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I just want to walk you through a couple of the resources we have. This is the website where you can access state resources. So if you go up here and click state resources, you can click on per state, the giant map exercise, and also the ArcGIS online component created by Rebecca and Anita. Then there's also a great tab here for apportionment, redistricting information, background on civics and government that Andy has provided, and he's also done an assessment with this, and then a geography tab. So I pulled up North Carolina because I'm biased since I live here, and this is an example of the kinds of materials you'll find. North Carolinians on the Move, that's looking at population change between 3 census periods, then the online GIS exercise, redistricting instructions, and then how to find a giant map in your state. And so I'll talk about this in the video that we're going to start here in a second. I just want to highlight West Forsyth High School. This is, I visited them with a giant map for their AP Human Geography class and their Civics and Government classes. This teacher was wearing his political socks, which I thought were very appropriate for the exercise. And students really liked this. They engaged in it, and they actually were debating about how to draw the district lines. We used string and chains to separate out districts, and you'll see that in the video too.
So I'm going to actually start the video for you, Saskia. And what I'm going to emphasize, I think, is that not only are the online resources there, but the kinds of resources you're about to see in the video are available regardless of where you live, the state that you're from. I'm sure there are many resources that Saskia and we can point you towards. So when I play the video, it's a little over 10 minutes long. It's probably longer than most videos we play, but I want you to stick with it. You'll be able to see the implementation of the map itself. As we've shared audio in the past in our webinars, that it seems to go well. If for some reason you can't, the audio doesn't work as well as you like, just know that this will be provided to you afterwards. So let's go ahead and get this started. Saskia, if you don't mind muting yourself while we play this, and then we'll take some questions at the end.
At Appalachian State, we're very fortunate to be partnered with National Geographic. One of the things I'm most proud of with our partnership and being the state steward of National Geographic is that I get to do outreach with teachers across the state, and also with students from K through 12 and college students, and also civic groups, because geography is the thread that holds all the other disciplines together. We often ask when something happens, but the real question is, where did it happen and why? And geography can answer that question.
Geography is important because it enables people to view or understand the world around them. For example, a working definition of geography is described as those things that give character to place. And what geographers do to try and understand the world, which is especially large, is they draw lines on maps. And these lines that they draw on maps, they divide the world into regions. To understand the world, geographers, as I said, come up with regions, and the vernacular region for this part of the state and world where we live is referred to as Appalachia, or the mountain. And so if you speak with local people, or if you look at business establishments. Oftentimes they'll have the name Appalachia or the mountain in the name of the business establishment. And this is referred to as a vernacular region, which talks about the distinctiveness of this place and this region in terms of its physical environment, as well as in terms of the people who settled here and who live here now. It's especially beneficial that we have Saskia on campus in the Department of Geography and Planning. Saskia is a state steward with National Geographic, and this is a great benefit not only to Appalachian, but to the state and the wider community, because the work that the state stewards do enables us to ensure that we have geographic literacy in the state, which enables human beings to understand the world, comprehend the world in a more meaningful way, and therefore hopefully make better decisions no matter what the occupation is.
Hello, my name is Dr. Mark Spond, and I serve as the liaison to the National Park Service at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. I'm here to talk to you today about geography, the importance of geography in the world today, and how geographic literacy can help young people and all people learn more about the world around them. Geography is an ancient study of the planet. It dates back to antiquity. The ancient Greeks, Romans, and many other people of past civilizations have thought about geography, even if they didn't think about it in the ways that contemporary geographers often frame the subject. Very important themes within geography include location, place, region, movement, and human-environment interaction. It's sometimes said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. I would argue a map is worth 1,000,000 words. Really good maps convey tremendous amounts of information quickly and clearly. Today, you're going to be working with a map of the state of North Carolina. The map contains both political features like place names of cities, national forests, and roads, and it also contains different colored polygons that represent different classes of land. Some of them are federal properties, others are state properties.
Today, we're going to do a lesson plan on apportionment and redistricting in the state of North Carolina, but this giant state map is available in every state. There's actually 2 of them in every state. So you can do this activity in your own state with students or with civic groups in your community. So what we're doing today is we're using census data from 1870, 1920, and 2010 census data to look at how human population has migrated across the state of North Carolina and what that means in terms of districting. So one of the things that we're considering with the upcoming census in 2020 is how many districts will we have in North Carolina and other states. And the reason census data is important is because every person is 1 vote. So currently, based on the 2010 census data in North Carolina, each district in North Carolina, we have 13 of them, but each district represents 733,000 people, 499. So what we're going to do today is look at how we distribute these districts and how it's subjective depending on who's drawing those districts. So first we're going to get started with our students here from Appalachian State, and we're going to look at how population has shifted in North Carolina starting in 1870. All right, you guys, let's go. Can someone put a plate on Wilmington, North Carolina? Wilmington is one of our top 10 cities according to the 1870 census. And next is Raleigh with 7,790 people, then New Bern, then Fayetteville, then Charlotte with 4,473 people. Next is Beaufort, and Abby and Kay, I'm gonna have you guys come over and locate Beaufort because it's not labeled on the map. So we are going to go at 34.7 degrees north to 76.7 degrees west. And where your feet touch is where we're going to put down a plate to represent 2,430 people in the year 1870 in Beaufort, North Carolina. Perfect. All right, who wants to put a plate on Washington? 2,094 people. Next is Asheville. And our last two, we're gonna need Abby and Kay again to find those because they're not labeled on the map. 35.9 degrees north, 76.7 degrees west. You guys meet up your feet and put down a plate, and that's Plymouth, North Carolina. And then the last place is 35.9 degrees north again, but 77.5 degrees west. Keep going, Kay, yay. And then where your feet meet up, that's Tarboro. And that's 1,340 people in 1870. Perfect. So what we're seeing in 1870 across North Carolina is that most people are living in the eastern part of the state. So then the next question is, how would you create districts when the population is distributed this way? So Kay and Abby, do you want to grab the chain? And what you guys will do is walk across the map and decide how you would divide the state of North Carolina in half. And there's no right or wrong answer, but you want to make sure that the population's also cut in half, right? Yeah. And you may have to move the chain over Raleigh to get 5 and 5, right? So one of you will have to. Uh-oh, we lost Raleigh. Good. And this is how subjective redistricting can be. How do we divide our state in half? How do we divide our state into 4s? How do we end up dividing our state into 13 different districts based on population? So we put down our blue plates to represent the 1870 census data, and we put down orange cones to represent the 1920 census data. But now we're moving on to the final stage of looking at the cities that have the highest population numbers in 2010 from that census data. So we're gonna have the students put the final green cones on top of the other census data points and look at how the populations have shifted across North Carolina. Okay, Charlotte. Now we have 731,000 people in Charlotte. Okay, Raleigh, 403,000 people. Greensboro. Winston-Salem, 229,000 people. Durham, 228,000 people. There you go. Fayetteville, 200,000 people. Nice job. Wilmington, 106,000 people. High Point, 104,000 people. Greenville, 84,000. Good job. Asheville, 83,000. So we finished our mapping exercise, and we have the shifts in population across North Carolina between 1870, 1920, and 2010. And North Carolina has grown in population from 1 million people to over 9,500,000 people. And like I said earlier, we're projected to only grow even more, especially in Mecklenburg and Wake County. So how are we going to redraw those districts? And this is what every state has to struggle with. Because again, what we're looking for with the census data is to make sure we count everybody, and that one person equals one vote. So that's why it's so important for everyone to participate in the census. But a lot of people don't understand how redistricting works. And usually that's because it's not an open process. Some states have a more open process than others, but it can be challenging because we can separate districts based on political boundaries and also racial boundaries. And some people's voices are suppressed because of how we draw the districts. So currently in North Carolina and Maryland, both cases have gone to the Supreme Court on March 27th, arguing that gerrymandering is occurring and that the lines of the districts are drawn according to political parties, not where people live in their communities. And drawing districts is hard because you don't want to separate people in cities. You want to keep communities together. You also want to keep entire counties in one district, and you can't go across physical landforms like rivers and other kind of features where there's natural separations in the geography. So how do you draw districts that are fair? How do you draw districts that are legal and keep communities together? And that's the big challenge after the 2020 census.
Hello, my name is Kay Kelly Jr. I'm currently a senior here at Appalachian State University. I'm double majoring in geography and community and regional planning, and then I'm getting my certificate in geographic information systems. And I'm also from Durham, North Carolina. So today's activity, I think, is a really good understanding or a look at what geography in place really means. So when we think about geography in place, I think a lot of times people like to think about, okay, when we say geography, we're looking at the 50 states and memorizing the capitals of each of those states. Though that is a good foundation for understanding what geography is, I think we should challenge people to actually take a step forward and really think about, okay, what does my presence in this space take up? So when we think about being a part of a city or a town, what resources do I have access to? How do I use those, and how do we connect that to something else, someone else, or somewhere else? So when we really think about geography in place, it's really good to challenge our students and also folks inside of the profession to think of it that way as well too.
My name is Abby Bonneback, and I'm a graduate student here at Appalachian State University. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina, and have fallen in love with the mountains here in Boone, North Carolina. I'm a graduate student, so I actually also completed my undergraduate degrees here at Appalachian State University. I received a geography and GIS degree, as well as a community and regional planning degree. This has propelled me to take geography classes throughout my time and allowed me to become a geography graduate student here. I have absolutely loved my time, and learning about maps is something that's very important in our society. In a globalization and interconnected world, everyone can talk to everyone, but knowing and understanding people and places, as well as their cultures and their environments, are very important, and is something we should really look forward to in the future. Doing activities like this giant map, it's a great opportunity for us to show children how important maps are in our future. And this is really important because geography isn't often included in education at the elementary level anymore. And so this is a great way to get students from around North Carolina, as well as the United States, to participate in geography, something that is helping us to be more connected than ever.
If you want to learn more about geography, contact me, Saskia van de Gevel, in the Department of Geography and Planning at Appalachian State University, and I'm happy to bring out the giant map to you, or get one of our great educators in the state to bring the map to you as well. We have 3 copies of the map in our state, and other states have at least 2. So please get your hands on a giant map. Please ask your state steward any questions you have related to geography, and we're happy to help you. The other thing I want to say is that if you have any other questions related to this project and gerrymandering, please go online and search for GeoCivics. You can find all of the teaching resources you need to use the giant map, the online ArcGIS activity, and any other civics information, and it's all housed per state, searchable on GeoCivics. Thank you.
Thanks, Saskia. Don't forget to unmute yourself. I'm going to forward our slide. Saskia, fantastic. Tell me a little bit about we just have a few moments to go, a few minutes left in our session tonight, but tell me a little bit about the ways in which your college students responded to the work that you did.
They loved it because anytime students can get on an object, it's better. And so it's tangible, it's real to them. They feel connected to it, and they feel connected to the issue in a different way. But the great pairing to this is the slide we have up here with the online component. So you start on the giant map, and then you can go online and actually draw in the districts digitally, like we were talking about, where you can go street to street, you can cross river systems, but it'll flag you and warn you if you're going out of, you want to stick to at least the minimum number of people per district per state. So Anita's developed this. I would highly recommend you check it out after you do the giant map exercise. She has developed one of these for every state, and it's a walkthrough story map of exactly how to do these online mapping exercises and drawing in districts per state. And it's a step-by-step guide, how you first draw in one line for multiple districts, and and then add more and more districts as you go. So she did a great job. I know we're running out of time, so I just want to add to contact any of us about, and then especially go to the GeoCivics website because it's where all the resources are.
Hey Saskia, how much does this cost? It seems like a lot of great resources.
It is absolutely free, Andy. Thanks for that plug. Rebecca will be thrilled to hear this because all of these resources are free. And again, we want to thank the NCRGE for funding this project. We want to especially thank Rebecca, Anita, and Andy for donating a ton of time, especially Rebecca and Anita. I mean, talking hundreds of hours to provide these resources for free for every state in the United States. So anyone can do this. It's absolutely free. The giant maps are free. All the resources are free.
Saskia, thank you so much. And I want to thank you and Sheila for giving us this really clear lens into trying to understand gerrymandering, but more importantly, not just understanding it on some intellectual and conceptual layer, but to really figure out ways to make it more accessible and have students really put their hands on grappling with not only the problems, but the solutions. Thank you, Saskia. Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all of our participants tonight for joining us for tonight's webinar. The National Humanities Center is very pleased to be able to offer these this webinar series from September to May. We are just about at the end of our season this year, our academic year. You can follow all of the work that we do at the National Humanities Center on our website, on our Twitter feed, and on our Facebook page. I would encourage you to follow us there and get updates not only on current activities and initiatives, but upcoming ones that you can participate in. I also want to remind you that when I close the room tonight, you'll be prompted to take a survey and an evaluation. Once you've completed that, you'll be able to download your certificate, and with that certificate, earn the CEU credits that for the hours that you've spent with us tonight. Our next webinar, the next to last webinar of this year's series, is scheduled not for April 30th, as the screenshot says, but rather May 23rd, next Thursday. We'll be working with the representatives from the United States Patent and Trademark Office with a session titled "To Promote the Progress of Science and Useful Arts, an Historical Journey of Innovation and the U.S. Patent System." We'll be offering that session in partnership with the National Council for History Education, and we would love to see all of you there next Thursday night, May the 23rd. Don't forget to contact Saskia, Rebecca, Anita, or myself if you have any questions about the resources that you've seen tonight. I hope you take advantage of them as you try to unlock the complexities of gerrymandering, both historically, legally, and geographically with your students. And we appreciate the work that you do. Have a great day at school tomorrow. End of year is coming soon. We'll see you at the next webinar series, webinar session of the National Humanities Center webinar series. Good night.